Attleboro, Massachusetts. Ian felt perspiration slip down between his shoulder blades. He never perspired under pressure. It was hard to regain your authority once everyone had seen you in your underwear. He had changed at lightning speed, and now moved through the room, speaking a few words here and there, trying to connect with as many notables as he could, trying to pick up clues as to who was out to sabotage him. An overly warm greeting could be just as telling as a brush-off. Ian had already spotted Magnus Hansen, the new head of the Thomas. Whenever Ian headed for him, it seemed as though Magnus was suddenly on the other side of the room. Back in the 1990s, Magnus had won 4 Olympic gold medals in downhill skiing and smashed all the speed records, and he was still a formidable athlete and a commanding presence. Tall, blonde, incredibly fit in a navy sweater and blazer, he moved through the room as though he were the host, shaking hands and clapping backs. Ian had been surprised when Magnus had taken over the leadership of the Thomas. He had dropped out of sight for years. There had been talk that he'd been asked to leave after some kind of financial trouble with the Thomas treasury. Things must have been cleared up. Ian made a mental note to discover the details. He watched as Magnus kissed Patricia O on both cheeks. She was the grandniece of Bay O, the former head of the ECATs, who is now in prison. She had never gotten involved with the Cahill family much. Her home was in Singapore, and she lived to shop and go out to lunch. Word was that Bay had given her a large allowance to stay out of his hair. Then suddenly, this year, she had become the ECAT branch leader. He watched Patricia as she touched Magnus's arm and said something in his ear. She seemed to sense Ian's eyes on her and flicked a glance at him. He smiled and nodded. Her nod was cool as she moved away through the crowd. Were they avoiding him? Mr. Berman appeared at the staircase. He struck a small gong 3 times. "Ladies and gentlemen, please proceed to the library," he intoned. Ian walked down the grand hallway, already rehearsing his first line. "Welcome, fellow Cahills. The spirit of Grace Cahill guides us as we meet in her beloved library." He had foiled an attack once today. He was prepared to hit back when challenged. His enemy would be expecting him to be slow. He or she would be thinking Ian would be at half power, and he'd be dialed up to 10. What was it that Hamilton always said? Bring it. He waited until silence fell, and pressed a button. The black screens that hung on every wall blazed to life. Cahill leaders from all over the world appeared, from India, Russia, Norway, Kenya, Morocco, New Zealand, Manila, and Cumbria, England. Ian gave a start. What was his father, Vikram Kabra, doing on screen? Sure, he was a major Lucian, but ever since Ian's mother, Isabel, had been disgraced and died, Vikram had been in seclusion, unavailable to everyone, including his own son. which didn't make that much of a difference. Ian thought the tang of bitterness twisting his mouth. He was surprised he'd noticed at all. His father had only existed in his life to criticize and blame. "Welcome, fellow Cahills," he began. "The spirit of grace..." Suddenly, it was like someone had thrown a blanket over his head. The lights went out. Everyone sat politely, thinking it was planned. It wasn't. Ian stabbed at the panel. Nothing happened. His power had been cut. The only illumination in the room was the faint bluish light from the screens as the Cahill notables waited. Ian jumped as the screen blazed to life and a voice boomed out of the speakers.